Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone tonight to a conversation we're going to have about the current toothpaste abrasion limits. This is a presentation that I've nursed for almost 10 years now, adding detail and adding science where we think it's appropriate as we learn more about the marketplace, as we learn more about toothpaste abrasives. But one thing we know for sure is that writings from early Greek, Roman, Buddhist, and Hebrew societies have recognized the desirability of clean teeth. And I'm sure when you look on, or when you watch TV and you see a white strips ad on television, you know that people want clean, beautiful teeth. And then to make that happen, there is a requirement of some apparatus for removing pellicle and stain. Some of these apparatuses included chewing sticks, and today they include toothpicks and sometimes even sponges. Modern dentistry has shown that was once referred to as brown pellicle, but is just what we call unsightly stain today, that accumulates on tooth surfaces can only be controlled with an abrasive containing dentifrice. The issue we're discussing here today is how we can achieve clean teeth with abrasive toothpastes without the undesired consequence of damage from abrasive tooth wear. Again, my name is Sam St. John. I work at the Procter Gamble Company, and my research here focuses on understanding the different products we sell and their impact on hard tissue, so dentin and enamel, for the treatment of cavities, of dental erosion, and of keeping your teeth clean. So thanks for taking some time with me today to learn about this important topic. So a dentifrice is a substance used with a toothbrush for the purpose of cleaning the accessible surface of teeth. And that was written by the American Dental Association's Council on Dental Therapeutics in 1970. Since 1907, dental scientists have conducted detailed research to answer the following questions. How abrasive does a dentifrice need to be? How much abrasion is too much? And how do we measure abrasion efficiently and effectively in the laboratory? Today we're going to help answer these questions by sharing with you the history of dentifrice abrasive development and the basis of the safety requirements of modern toothpaste. There are lots of different ways you could structure this presentation. We could focus on just the test method and what it tells us today. We could focus on the development of international standards and the consensus of how toothpaste abrasion is measured. But I think it's very helpful to root this presentation in the 100-year history that has been done to understand toothpaste abrasives and abrasive tooth wear. So if you searched on the internet, you'd see that the relative dent and abrasion score, that's what we call the RDA, is suggested to be limited to 250 for toothpaste abrasives in the US. But why this number and where did it come from? It's helpful to start by talking about the International Standards Organization, or the ISO. The ISO is a non-governmental organization, and it's the world's largest developer and publisher of international standards. Today, this organization administers global toothpaste safety guidelines. And to develop these guidelines, they work with a network of national standards institutes in 157 countries to develop consensus and scientifically based test methods. So in the US, the ISO works expressly with the Standards Organization in the United States and the American Dental Association and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology feed into the US-based testing organization that for topics specifically related to dental care. So these organizations partner with industry and academic groups throughout the U.S., and a large consensus underpins each standard. And that's how it's developed today. But this was not the case 60 years ago when toothpaste abrasion safety limits were first proposed. So how did we arrive at the RDA as a safety test with the 250 limit? Understanding this will at the same time answer the questions, how abrasive does a toothpaste need to be, how much is too much abrasion, and how can we measure abrasion quickly and efficiently in the lab? In the end, what this presentation will show you is how an industry has worked closely with dentists to set an abrasion limit of RDA 250 to ensure that toothpastes are safe for a lifetime of use and are also effective at keeping your teeth free from stain. So, like I said, these are the objectives. in this continuing education course. The first is to review with you the science and the history of the present dent and abrasion limit. The second is to reaffirm the limit as being safe and effective guideline to produce dentifrices that can be used for a lifetime. The third is to review practical dental applications of this knowledge. It's important to emphasize that the science we will review developed slowly over 100 years, and you're going to see that on the next slide in an overview. Each new finding was intricately linked to the preceding published research. I'm going to try to break it down succinctly, but to also really endeavor to give you a clear understanding of how this research knits together. So you're seeing, this is a timeline, and we're going to use this timeline, we're going to come back to it through the presentation to anchor you to the research that we're reviewing. So really what I'm showing you here is an overview of the major developments and innovations on our way to developing an abrasion safety limit of RDA 250. As you can see, this research started in the early 1900s and has progressed all the way through to today with an ISO-administered standard. In 1907, we begin with research conducted by W.D. Muller. He established modern toothpaste abrasive science while he was Dean of the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, an organization that we continue to have an ongoing collaboration with. Miller's research was directed at understanding why cervical notches formed along the gum line in patients with good hygiene habits. And to emphasize what those notches look like, you can see them here along the gum line in this illustration from 1958. Muller wanted to understand why was damage occurring to the teeth of those people inclined to follow dentists' recommendations for keeping their teeth clean. Dr. Muller determined that characteristic abrasive lesions on the tooth are distinguished by these V-shaped cervical notches along the gum line that form because of highly abrasive particles in toothpastes. But I should say, in 1907, we have to consider what Miller's perspective was on a highly abrasive toothpaste and how that would be different from today. And we're going to go over that in a little bit. In 1907, highly abrasive dentifrice formulations included things like ground cuttlefish bone, pulverized coral, pumice, and raw sand. These types of abrasives are hard, coarse, and very crystalline particles that can cause significant damage to both dentin and enamel. Muller clearly linked these highly abrasive particles to cervical notches that formed along the gum line. So this was really the first inclination that we had to do something as a society, as industry linked with dentists, linked with consumers, to stop these cervical notches from forming. Throughout the from 1910 to about 1940, there was a pretty significant investigation of tooth wear. So Dr. Miller's work kicked off just an explosion of wear-related science in the early part of the 20th century. Significantly, during this period, Drs. Bunting, Rickett, Head, Carney, Wright and Fensky, and Kimball corroborated Dr. Miller's findings that abrasives can cause wear to the dentin when you rub them against the surface. And Drs. Wright, Fensky, Tainter, and Epstein demonstrated that wear on metal blocks does not correlate to the wear of enamel or to dentin. And they looked at things like antimony, copper, and silver. So there was really no substrate that could substitute for enamel and dentin. So the authors collectively determined that dentin would need to be brushed ex vivo, so outside of the patient's dentition, whose teeth and those teeth could be obtained when they were removed in order to develop a consistent abrasivity standard. And in fact, that is still true today. Safety testing and abrasion research is conducted on extracted human teeth. This is partly because no suitable substitute has been found, and that's been true for 100 years. And it's partly true because we want to make sure that the results that we generate are on the clinically meaningful substrate of human enamel and dentin. And it's kind of an interesting fact. Procter Gamble maintains one of the largest tooth collection programs in the world, and we work with over 40 dental offices in the Cincinnati region and some outside Cincinnati to collect donated teeth for our research. So if any of those dental offices are listening, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. So in 1941, Dr. Richard Manley, while working for the Procter Gamble Company, significantly advanced tooth abrasion research with a paper demonstrating that these characteristic V-shaped notches could be recreated in the lab, and these notches are linked to dentifrice abrasives and brushing technique. This is a really important part. So let's take a look at what we see here. First, these notches, these are before and after pictures. So in the 40s, they literally took images of teeth from the side, and then they would brush them, and they would take another image, and then they would blow the traces of these images up by hand before and after. And what you can see, these hash-marked areas near the pointer, that's areas where the dentin has been removed. And what's important to see here is at the top part, where my pointer is now, is the sound enamel, and that is unworn. But right next to, immediately where the enamel stops, you can see that the dentin is abraded away. So Dr. Manley was able to recreate these notches that formed along the gum line. And importantly, he had to brush them across the tooth, so sort of like a back and forth motion. He could not recreate these notches if he brushed up and down, so along the axis of the tooth. So, and this indicated that technique plays a critical factor in determining the type of wear that you have on your tooth, in addition to just the presence of an abrasive in the toothpaste. So Manley undertook his work as a means to quantify the differences between abrasives in a controlled and systematic way. His research was important because it showed three things. Cervical abrasion lesions are caused by brushing with an abrasive-containing toothpaste only. Brushing with water and soap did not form lesions. Cross-brushing caused more wear than did brushing along the tooth axis, and dentin abrades much more rapidly than enamel. So this finding served as the first acknowledgement that dentin is the portion of the tooth that we need to be concerned with when developing abrasivity standards. Having established that dentin is the most important substrate when considering tooth wear, the development of standards for tooth wear had to account for when, how much, and for how long cementum and dentin are exposed to the oral environment, because they're the part that are at risk for toothpaste abrasion, and they are typically covered by the gingiva. So in 1941, Dr. Paul Kitchen, who had a long and distinguished career as a dental scientist, published an epidemiological survey of U.S. citizens. We still pull from the survey today. So in this research, he demonstrated that the incidence and severity of toothpaste abrasion increases with age. So what you see here are percent of people that show abrasion in different age groups, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, of different severities. So the least severe is this column, then this is more severe, more still severe, and the highest severity. So this is anywhere where less than 0.5 millimeters, where over 0.5 and less than 1 millimeter, and then where over 1.5 millimeters. So they actually go in and graded the cervical notches using a perio probe. So Kitchen found that roughly 40% of 20 to 29-year-olds exhibited some gradable tooth abrasion, but less than 5% of subjects in this age group had wear measuring over 0.5 millimeters. In the 30-year-old age group, the percentage of persons with wear increased slightly, and the percentage of persons with wear greater than 0.5 millimeters increased from less than 5% to greater than 10%. In 50-year-olds, that number of subjects with any tooth wear leveled off to approximately 75%, and those exhibiting wear greater than 0.5 millimeters had leveled off to about 30%. So there is a leveling of tooth wear with age, and it starts in your 20s. And then most cervical lesions are less than 1.5 millimeters deep in populations even with advanced age. So the incidence in the 1940s of severe notches was pretty limited, even though they had much more abrasive toothpaste than we have today. All right, so we need to break this down a little bit more. So what I'm going to show you next is Dr. Kitchen broke down these populations into those that had good hygiene, so brushed regularly, and poor hygiene, so they didn't brush at all. And what we're going to see is that there's a critical level of gingival recession that you have to have before you get tooth abrasion. So these are the folks I'm going to show you first. So this first chart shows aggregate results for all age groups, genders, and teeth where oral hygiene habits were absent. So these are people that did not brush. On the bottom, on the x-axis, we have millimeters of exposure. So this is how much recession you have, how much gingival recession you have. And on the y-axis, we have indicates the proportion of 550 people in this group that have a given amount of exposure due to gum recession. So this first bar tells us that 17% of the people have 0.5 millimeters of recession, and as a consequence of that, they have 4% of the people will show this type 1 tooth wear. Does that make sense? So now if we go to this bar, 28% of the people have at least 1 millimeter of recession, and then when you have 1 millimeter of recession, you have a certain type of tooth wear, this type 1 tooth wear and a little bit of type 2 tooth wear, and so on. So when you have 1.5 millimeters of recession, you have, again, this type 1 tooth wear. So what you can take away from this graph is when you have poor hygiene, for any amount of recession, you have a pretty similar amount of wear, not that much wear. So now I want to think about what this looks like in a population where oral hygiene habits are present. So these are toothbrushers. Now you can see that first that these people have a lot less gingival recession. So, and this was a group of 435 people, and they have a lot less gingival recession. So we would expect this because these people routinely clean their mouth with toothpaste, which helps prevent gingivitis and gum recession. However, notice that the proportion of the population with cervical abrasion is a whole lot higher. For example, at 1 millimeter of exposed dentin, so right here, 1 millimeter of recession, 14% of the population has cervical lesions up to 0.5 millimeters deep, and 3% of cervical lesions greater than, or 0.5 to 1 millimeters deep. These are higher rates than those for people where oral hygiene habits are absent. Notice also that the severity of the cervical notches increases for dentin with at least 1 millimeter of exposure. So when you have at least 1 millimeter of exposure, the type of abrasion you have is a lot more severe. So overall, there's a marked increase in severity and proportion of the population with cervical notches when at least 1 millimeter of dentin is exposed and good oral hygiene habits are present. So Kitchen, on this basis, drew the following conclusions. 1, cervical notches are linked to the presence of oral hygiene habits that include toothpaste with abrasives. The severity and the proportion of the population with cervical lesions are higher in those where oral hygiene habits are present, and at least 1 millimeter of exposed dentin is required to generate cervical lesions. So it's important to emphasize that this research was carried out in 1941 when many toothpastes were formulated with abrasives that are too harsh by today's standards. We know that unnecessarily high abrasives have been removed from the market since 1941, and today there exists greater societal awareness of proper hygiene techniques. There's no doubt if a similar survey were done today, a lower incidence of deep cervical lesions would be observed. Okay, so we really want to take away here that when you have good hygiene, you have to have a certain amount of recession to first expose the dentin, and the exposed dentin, which is more susceptible to abrasion, can then be worn away. And you are at risk of wearing away that dentin when you brush back and forth, in addition to using what we're going to see, and we're going to characterize these highly abrasive toothpaste for you. I think you'll be stunned at how abrasive they were. Remember, they had cuttlefish bone. All right, so in this next portion, so this, Miller linked cervical notches to dentifrice abrasives and cross-brushing, 1907. We learned a lot from different authors about substrates that could be brushed. We learned that we have to brush dentin. We can use cross-sections of brushing dentin in the lab to measure tooth wear, and we need at least 1 millimeter of exposed dentin required for clinical measurement of cervical notches, and generation of cervical notches. So Epstein recognized in the mid-1940s that there's no clear definition of a safe upper limit for toothpaste abrasives yet. That's on the way. Okay. So we know that toothpaste abrasives are required to keep teeth free from stain and debris. And it's also clear that toothpaste abrasives can cause wear. However, this wear was not clinically significant in all individuals, as we saw in the last few slides. So the development of the safety standard requires us to balance the desired treatment effect, clean teeth, against the undesired side effect, tooth wear. So to do this, in 1948, Dr. Kitchen and his collaborator, Dr. Hamilton Robinson, I think they were both at Ohio State University at the time, published a critical paper that developed a clinical correlation between cleaning ability of toothpaste and the laboratory abrasion of these pastes. So in this study, the authors had toothpaste supplied that had different levels of abrasivity as determined in the laboratory. So you're going to see that here. This laboratory scale measures the millimeters of dentin lost when you brush a tooth for 100,000 strokes, using that photograph technique I showed you. On the y-axis, Doctors Kitchen and Robinson collected clinical amounts clinical measures of how much stain was left on people's teeth when they brushed with these different toothpastes in the chart in a crossover design. So they did 15 panelists. They would brush with water for 2 weeks to build stain, and then they'd switch to a toothpaste for 2 weeks to remove that stain. And Doctors Kitchen and Robinson graded the stain themselves, and each doctor graded each patient independently, and they made sure their scores agreed. So the y-axis is a measure of the remaining stain after completing this 2-week stain removal study. And the x-axis is the laboratory measure of abrasion. So the chart indicates that as you increase the abrasion of the toothpaste, you are able to remove more stain. So clearly a brush alone does not damage dentin, but it also doesn't remove any stain. So that would be like up here. The toothpaste on the far right was actually a commercial toothpaste that caused a lot of concern about dentists. They actually published pictures of this person, of someone using a toothpaste like this, and they observed some pretty severe cervical notches. So that's way out on this end of the graph. So, and while this paste removed all the stain from the tooth, it's clearly more abrasive than it needs to be. So you can see between these two extremes, there's a point of diminishing returns, where only a small amount of tooth stain is left, but you need a really highly abrasive toothpaste to remove it. So essentially, the researchers looked at this graph and said, right about here is where a few things are satisfied. The dentists were not sending in letters to the ADA about toothpastes right here. Patients are able to keep their teeth free from stain, and if they used something more abrasive than this, they don't get a lot from it. You may get a little bit more cleaning, but you pay for that with a lot more abrasion. So this point of diminishing returns is determined by Kitchen and Robinson as 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes. And above this, the paste is unnecessarily abrasive and only delivers a marginal amount of additional cleaning. So Now what we're going to do is, this is the RDA 250 limit right here, this 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes. So what we're going to reflect on is how we get this 1 millimeter of cut depth to today's RDA equals 250. But I really want to emphasize that the RDA 250 balanced these three competing objectives. One, eliminating the toothpaste abrasives that were causing dentists concern, and they were sending letters into the ADA. Finding the point of diminishing returns where adding more abrasive doesn't give you cleaner teeth. And three, a laboratory technique that allowed me to measure that amount of abrasion. So these three things come together right here in 1948. So we work with our competitors. Colgate is one of them. In an article published by Alexander Bushel at the Toilet Goods Association meeting on behalf of the Colgate-Palmolive Company, the author gave an extensive review of the fundamental research done to characterize dentifrice abrasives and indicated that the industry had adopted Kitchen and Robinson's recommendation that toothpaste abrasives should be limited to no more than 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes. As a means to further standardize the industry, he proposed in vague terms a reference abrasive be used and that all future development refer to this standard. In 1976, Dr. John Heffernan, whom we will discuss later, codified the RDA test method. He recommended using Bushel's originally recommended reference abrasive. So in 1980, when the Federal Register required that all cavity-fighting dentifrices limit their tooth wear to 2.5 times the abrasiveness of the reference standard, it also indicated Bushel's reference abrasive should be used. So from 1948 to 1966, methods were developed that measured tooth wear and were agreed upon by both industry and academic scientists as well as professional organizations like the American Dental Association. The next important phase of research was to develop standards and globally agreed upon measures. So why the RDA matters? So what I showed you, this 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes, it's a complicated technique to run, and 100,000 strokes took 4 or 5 days to generate in the lab. So it's a lot of brushing continuously. It's difficult to image the pictures and align pre and post images, and it only takes into account the profile of the tooth, not the whole body of the tooth. So the RDA, which will develop and grow from this original brushing technique, this original brushing method, is going to be faster. It takes into account the whole body of the tooth and the entire root during brushing, and it's much easier to analyze the data. So the first step towards this standard was taken in 1958 when R.J. Grabenstetter, also working for the Procter Gamble Company, developed the first industrial standard brushing machine. So he published an image of his brushing machine in a drawing, and we in fact use the exact same brushing machine today. It's called the VA brushing machine. Everyone who brushes teeth to determine the RDA uses the same machine, and this is a picture from my lab of a toothpaste RDA brushing machine. We affectionately call it the V8 machine. As you can see, this is number 4. We have 5 of them in the lab. So it's really, in 1958, Grabenstetter working to develop the brushing machine is really the precursor to the modern FDA, or the modern RDA. And the way that we measure the wear in the RDA is you irradiate the tooth. So we take teeth and we send them to a nuclear reactor in the upper Midwest, and they stick these teeth inside the reactor and they get bombarded with neutrons, and we convert some of the phosphorus in the tooth into radioactive phosphorus. So we bring that back and we put them in the machine and we brush them, and we essentially measure the radioactivity of the slurry that comes off, and from that we can compare that to the reference abrasive, and we can determine how much tooth we brushed away. And it's very easy to measure radioactive decay using something like a Geiger counter to measure how much tooth was removed. So those first steps were taken in 1958. So in 1968, there was a lot of work that still has to be done. Stuckey and Muller, Stuckey is still around working today. Dr. Stuckey has nearly 300 publications, over 400 presentations, served as the editor, co-editor of 8 textbooks. So he's really well known in the field. He worked with a collaborator to demonstrate a few things. A clear correlation between the number of strokes and tooth wear. This allowed us to reduce the amount of time that we spent brushing. So this linear relationship was demonstrated, and we could reduce the brushing time. It showed that the radio tracer method is highly reproducible, and different labs could do it. So you can do this, many labs do this. In fact, we work with 3 different labs today to measure the RDA in our toothpastes. And it reconfirmed that dentin is the key substrate for evaluating tooth wear because it wears so much faster. As you can see here, on average, dentin wears at 10 times the rate of enamel. So where have we come to now? So recall that we knew that cervical notches were linked to dentifrice abrasives and cross-brushing. The shadow graph method using pictures was used to measure tooth wear. We established a critical exposure level, so how much gingival recession you had to have before you saw wear in the lab. But in the 1940s, there was no clear answer to the ideal abrasion requirement for effective dentifrices. So in the 1940s, Kitchen and Robinson said that beyond a certain level of abrasion, there's no significant gain in stain removal. That's 1 millimeter of cut depth, 100,000 strokes. Grabenstetter developed his radio tracer technique to replace the complicated shadow graph method. Bushel had indicated that Kitchen and Robinson's recommendation had been adopted by the entire industry, so we know that the industry and academia had accepted this 1 millimeter cut depth recommendation. And Stuckey and Muller show that many labs can run the radioactive method, so you see the broad adoption of a common technique to measure toothpaste abrasives. The ADA held the position now that dentists should work with patients to select the most appropriate dentifrice. But we still don't really know what that means, and you're going to see what that means over these next couple decades. So in 1970, the ADA published a paper showing the abrasivity of pastes on the market at the time. This paper talks about relating the scores to the in this paper to the abrasivity limits suggested by Kitchen and Robinson. This is done through using the reference abrasive calcium pyrophosphate in a simple toothpaste. Interestingly, this article generated huge public interest and prompted the ADA to standardize the abrasion tests. Because of this article, a committee was formed and headed by Dr. Heffernan to create a standard method that incorporated the recommendation of the abrasion limit as determined by Kitchen and Robinson. So let's return to this scale. So I had introduced this scale, and we had 1 millimeter of cut depth per 100,000 strokes. So we can rescale the pastes from the original paper by Kitchen and Robinson using information from Procter Gamble's archives. So Procter Gamble sponsored this research, and we actually kept the formulations from this original paper dated all the way back to 1948. I looked these up in the archives, and I was able to look at the formulation of this particular toothpaste circled in red. Fortunately, this formulation is very similar to a toothpaste still sold today. So we know the modern RDA of this historically published toothpaste and its clinical effectiveness and its measurement of abrasion on the original shadow graph scale. So using that, we were able to rescale the shadow graph scale to the modern ADA scale. And you see that this 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes was in this cluster of abrasives here, which is very near RDA of 250. So we can now see the close association between Kitchen and Robinson's data with the new scale of the RDA and their recommendation that pastes limit themselves to 1 millimeter of cut depth, or in this case a relative score of 250. This was a toothpaste at that 250 limit, and we can see it here still falls near that 250 limit. So in 1970, Dr. John Hefferon, the director of the Division of Biochemistry at the Research Institute of the ADA Health Foundation and the director of chemistry on the Council of Dental Therapeutics of the ADA, was chartered by the ADA and industry groups to lead a collaboration with 11 companies to standardize a method used to determine the laboratory abrasiveness of toothpastes. So we reviewed the literature and other industrial methods to determine that the refined grab-and-setter method was the best for standardized dentifrice abrasion measurement. They established that the standard reference abrasive calcium pyrophosphate be used for all abrasion testing, and we still use that original lot of reference abrasive today. This intentionally linked future data to Kitchen and Robinson's original recommendation. His work was sponsored by the industry, the British Standards Institute, the ISO, and the American Dental Association. From 1976 until today, the RDA method has existed in this form and has successfully protected consumers from overly harsh toothpaste abrasives. So the Federal Register is the official daily publication for rules of the U.S. federal agencies and organizations, as well as executive orders and other presidential documents. The CFR, or Code of Federal Regulations, is the codification of the permanent rules established by the Federal Register. This document contains the regulations of agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, or the Drug Enforcement Agency. And it's used to enforce It's used to enforce and execute laws passed by Congress. Section 21 of the CFR deals with regulations on foods and drugs, essentially the portion of the CFR that's maintained by the FDA. In 1980, all toothpastes were fluoridated. Therefore, in 1980, as part of the regulation of fluoridated toothpaste, they also included language that regulated toothpaste abrasivity. As part of the anti-caries proposed monograph established to regulate over-the-counter drugs that treated dental caries, language was included to ensure that products sold were safe, effective, and not misbranded. In 1980, the FDA included wording that stated, "In the opinion of the panel, there is no indication for a dentifrice for daily use with an abrasivity level above 250 as measured by a method using dentin as a substrate." We have already seen that abrasive of 250 corresponds to two things. It's 2.5 times the reference abrasive used in 1970 by the ADA and in 1976 by Dr. Hefferon, and it also corresponds to 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes as determined by Kitchen and Robinson. So let's just put all this together now. So right before this period in history, up until 1970, the radio tracer technique was developed and correlated with shadowgraphs. The reference to industry adoption of Kitchen and Robinson's recommendation appeared and was outlined by Bushel. Linear wear of oral hard tissue, dentin enamel, was investigated so that we could shorten the brushing times from 100,000 strokes. We determined that beyond a certain level, namely 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 strokes, no significant gain in stain removal was observed, and dentists must work with patients to select the most appropriate abrasive for their teeth. So the ADA focused public concern on abrasives and dentifrices and resolved to publish data for dentists to use in making choices with patients. 1970 manufacturers had adopted Kitchen and Robinson's limit voluntarily, and using the 1970 toothpaste, the 1 millimeter cut depth is equivalent to an RDA of 250, and we were able to establish that length. The RDA 250 limit was established by a panel in reference to Hefferon's recommendation. We saw that codified in the original 1980 proposed caries monograph for fluoridated containing toothpastes. And the ISO begins to administering dentifrice making rules and guidelines in the mid-90s. And that's what we're going to learn about next. It's worthwhile to emphasize that all pastes less than the 250 limit are safe for a lifetime of use. Finally, by 1995, the International Standards Organization, or ISO, began administering toothpaste safety guidelines and the test to determine toothpaste abrasivity. Okay, so the methods we use to measure toothpaste abrasion are over 50 years old, and do they continue to protect us as they were intended? And in fact, they do. So when I started at Procter Gamble, I worked with Dr. White, who had encouraged me to re-explore these limits using modern measurement techniques. So I wanted to establish a clear relationship between the present-day safety limits and the fundamental abrasion science used to establish those limits. What we used in this paper, we took pastes with a known RDA and we measured their abrasion on dentin using a modern instrument called a profilometer that can very sensitively measure tissue, measure the 3D topography of a surface. When we do that, you can see we get a certain amount of microns of wear for different RDA pastes following brushing for about, I can't remember exactly how many strokes I used. I have to go back and check my reference. But we can extrapolate this, which I've done here, so I can blow that up to what the abrasion was on the last slide. I can extrapolate that to 100,000 strokes. And I know that's okay because of the work that Stuckey and Muller did. So we took those pastes and we had a dicalcium phosphate dihydrate containing toothpaste, a silica containing toothpaste, and an aluminosilica blend. And using the correlation between these three toothpastes, I could project what the cut depth would be for a paste at the 250 limit, and lo and behold, it's 1 millimeter of cut depth, nearly exactly. So in fact, the limits established originally by Kitchen and Robinson translated into the radioactive dentin abrasion method by Grabenstetter and retranslated back into physical measures of loss using a profilometer, all continue to correlate with each other. So I think it's even more interesting to take a look at the really abrasive toothpaste that dentists were concerned with in the 1940s. This had an RDA approaching 1,000. And when you look at what that would mean today, that would mean nearly 5 millimeters of tooth loss in 100,000 strokes. This is the toothpaste that people were concerned with in 1940. And this is the toothpaste that was effectively removed from the market by collaboration between industry, academia, and standards organizations, including the American Dental Association and the ISO. So what can we say in conclusion? Dentists determined that abrasives are needed to keep teeth clean and to reduce stain. Dentists showed highly abrasive toothpaste can cause wear. And we answered, how abrasive does a toothpaste need to be to balance these competing desires of having clean teeth without causing tooth wear? The industry adopted this limit of 1 millimeter of cut depth and 100,000 laboratory strokes and eliminated most abrasive pastes in conjunction with dentists and public concerns. The limit eventually placed on a relative scale at an RDA of 250. Scientists and dentists in the early 1900s believed that a toothpaste's primary role was to clean the accessible region of the oral hard tissue. However, it was recognized that oral hygiene with abrasive-containing toothpaste with fluoride helps prevent tooth decay, maintain healthy gingiva, prevent stain accumulation, and reduce the intensity of mouth odor. But how abrasive should a dentifrice be? This question was tackled and answered in the 40s and 50s. Researchers correlated a laboratory abrasion scale with clinical measures of toothpaste cleaning ability. They discovered that above a certain level of abrasiveness, any small gain in cleaning ability was purchased at the cost of greatly increased tooth abrasion, as measured by the depth of a cervical notch abraded at the gum line. They recommended an abrasion limit that the industry adopted and that provided the eventual foundation for the 250 RDA limit. All pastes that fall under this limit are safe for a lifetime of use when used appropriately. So remember, there's a correlation of cleaning from a dentifrice to the laboratory abrasion. That was brought together with dentists who relayed their concern of the most abrasive compositions to the professional organizations like the ADA. Those two things came together to limit toothpaste abrasives to 250 based on cleaning efficacy and safety. So I'm going to take your questions for a little bit, and feel free to type those in. While you're typing those in, I have a few questions that commonly come up when I give this presentation, and I'm going to go through those now. So is it safe to recommend toothpaste with RDA values in the higher range, let's say 150 to 200 to patients? Yes, all paste with an RDA score less than 250 are safe for a lifetime of use. In the epidemiological research that was conducted in the mid-1900s, only a small percentage of the population at advanced age had over 1.5 millimeters of wear due to very high abrasive toothpaste and a cross-brushing technique. The 250 RDA limit keeps this from occurring in today's population. Should patients with sensitivity only use toothpastes with very low RDA values? So no, again, as indicated by Kitchen and Robinson, all pastes with an RDA score less than 250 are safe for a lifetime of use. However, if patients have sensitivity, they should see their dentist immediately because it may indicate a more serious health concern. It's always wise that if there's any pain at all in a patient's mouth, that they should see their dentists. If it's routine sensitivity caused by dentin tubule exposure to the oral cavity, stannous containing toothpaste products form a smear layer helping to prevent sensitivity, so they form a layer over these tubules, or potassium nitrate containing toothpaste can help dampen the tooth pain. So what's the best advice for patients to reduce the odds of dental abrasion? So modern toothpaste are safe for a lifetime of use. However, as we saw in the presentation, severe cervical abrasion only occurs when patients have gingival recession exceeding 1 millimeter. Dr. Walter Gorman published in 1967 a significant paper that discussed the etiology of gingival recession. The largest cofactors for gingival recession include tooth malalignment, toothbrush trauma, tooth calculus, gingival inflammation, and occlusal trauma, meaning that patients should work with their dentist to reduce or eliminate these cofactors to reduce the odds of dental abrasion. Some simple steps include flossing, brushing with a paste to reduce or eliminate gingivitis. You can do this by brushing with stannous or tin-containing toothpastes. Committing to regular dental visits and cleanings, and using soft bristle toothbrushes while brushing with the Bass technique, or like a circular up and down technique. Patients can also now choose power brushes with pressure sensors for better cleaning and less gingival trauma. So for pastes with the RDA less than 250, is a lower number safer? No. Again, all pastes with an RDA less than 250 are safe for a lifetime of use. So with that, I'm happy to start taking some questions. So the first question is, patients of mine sometimes choose clay or bentonite tooth powders as a natural alternative. What were the old school tooth powders made from? So the tooth powders that were highly abrasive, again, were things like cuttlefish bone and sand, and they were really highly abrasive toothpastes. I would, without knowing exactly what brand of toothpaste these are, I would suggest that if they were purchased in the United States of America, that the manufacturer had limited the RDA of these toothpastes to less than 250. You can probably verify that by searching some information in the literature. The trouble with some of these more natural alternatives like clay or bentonite is they're not very compatible with fluoride, and fluoride is a very important component of toothpaste for helping to prevent tooth decay. So we at Crest always recommend that patients choose a fluoride-containing toothpaste, and in those toothpastes on the market, those are regulated to ensure that their abrasives are not above 250. That's how I'd answer that question. I would have to look in the research more to look at clay or bentonite specifically. So the next question we have, are there any concerns for higher RDAs with ultrasonic brushes? If so, where would be a safe number to keep a patient at who use these? So that's a really good question. As you can, so when the RDA was standardized, we also used a standard manual toothbrush. We affectionately refer to it as the ADA standard brush. It's also like an old Oral-B 40 indicator, if you remember what those toothbrushes look like. With power brushes, we know that people push less hard. So we would anticipate that because of this, you would get less trauma, less dentin exposure, and therefore less dentinal abrasion. The RDA is measured on dentin, so it's ensuring that you will not abrade the softer substrate of your tooth for a lifetime of wear. Enamel is much, much, much harder than dentin and is definitely safe for any of the power brushes we sell today with any safe abrasive in a toothpaste. Is there a list of toothpaste with their respective RDAs? There are some really well-respected publications that show cleaning scores of toothpastes published with their RDA. One of the most authoritative paper is that published by Bruce Skemmerhorn. He works at Therametric Technologies. It's a company in Indiana that does third-party measurements, and they published recently, I think a few years ago, a survey of the marketplace showing RDA scores for different toothpastes and their cleaning ability. It was published in the Journal of Clinical Dentistry. So if you want a copy of that article, you can reach out to the editor of that publication and get one, or feel free to send me an email, I think. Hopefully my contact information will be listed with this CE course. You can always send a note to someone at Procter Gamble Oral Care, and we will get you a copy of that article. Oh, what about a toothpaste with ACP? If you mean amorphous calcium phosphate, ACP is not an abrasive, but it is a source, an extra source of calcium and phosphate that is typically added to a toothpaste to help reduce or help buffer acids and return your mouth to a natural pH. So if you see ACP and it stands for amorphous calcium phosphate on the box, then it's not an abrasive, and it's there to help return the pH balance of your mouth to sort of its natural level. Is the RDA number listed on toothpaste? So most toothpastes don't list their RDA number on them, but many of them have them published in the literature. We know there's a lot of information already on a box of toothpaste, and we have to be selective about what information we put on that's meaningful for the patient. So at least at Procter Gamble and my colleagues at other companies, major toothpaste manufacturers, we ensure that a toothpaste is safe and that the abrasive is safe. So we make sure that you can use it for a lifetime. So is the ADA's RDA limit 200? No, it's not. So if you go to the ADA's website, they just re-clarified their position on the toothpaste RDA limit, and that is 250. What is the abrasiveness of baking soda? I don't know. That's a good question. It's probably under 50. It's pretty low. It's pretty low. And baking soda continues dissolving as you brush with it, so it's not there very long. So is there a toothpaste out with an RDA over 250 that is only for temporary use? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the whole breadth of the marketplace. I know that dentists, when they use the prophy paste, some of those can be over 250, but they're limited use under a controlled circumstance. And I can definitely say that if a toothpaste is over an RDA of 250, it will not have the ADA seal. So if you're very concerned about toothpaste being over 250, make sure you pick a toothpaste that has the ADA seal on it. So could you repeat the mechanism of action for Stens versus KNO3 for toothpaste sensitivity? I can. Stens physically occludes the tubules in your dentin, helping to reduce the difference in pressure between the inside of the tooth and the outside, reducing stimulation of the nerve. And KNO3, I don't know if that mechanism is as well understood, but we do know that it dulls nerve sensitivity. So that's kind of how they work. Both of them can be effective for treating sensitivity. Pick which one's best for you, I suppose. To what extent does bristle design contribute to abrasiveness? Does your brushing machine use a certain type of brush or bristle? So yes, we use, there's a reference brush that we use that's specified for use with the RDA method. Bristle design, that's something that we have investigated, and bristle design is mostly there for improved cleaning, and it can help aid in the removal of plaque from hard-to-reach places. We are continuing to learn about the impact of bristle design has on abrasiveness, but our initial data seem to suggest that it's dominated by the toothpaste and not the bristle design. What I'd like to return to, though, is that you are at risk for gingival abrasion, you are at risk for abrasion at the gum line on your dentin when you have gingival recession. So you want to make sure that you pick a bristle design and a brush that does the least amount of trauma to your gingiva. That will prevent recession, that will prevent dentin exposure, and that will reduce your chances of developing tooth wear. I've noticed that a lot of people have started using charcoal to whiten teeth. How abrasive would this be? It's a good question. Excuse me. I don't know. I'll add that one to the list of things that I measure in the lab. I might be interested to see what that does. There was a patient at the dental school who was using a wire brush and Comet cleanser. Oh Lord, what what do you think the RDA of this setup would be? A lot, probably a lot. I would tell that person to stop doing that as soon as possible and see their dentist. Really, with wire brushes and Comet cleanser, not only is Comet not developed for use in your mouth, the wire brush can probably cause pretty significant gingival trauma, which is something you want to avoid. So, yeah, help that person out. Are whitening toothpaste always more abrasive? That's a good question. So whitening can occur lots of different ways. Some of it can be chemical stain lifting and prevention. Some of it can be abrasive related. Toothpastes from different manufacturers try to balance this chemical cleaning with this abrasive cleaning. So they're not always more abrasive. They're not always more abrasive. But you'll have to look at the specific toothpaste to see which ones have a higher RDA scale. I would like to return to the fact that if it's made by a major reputable manufacturer, it has an RDA less than 250, so it is safe for a lifetime of use regardless of if it's whitening or not. But if that's something of a concern of yours, you can definitely find that information in the literature. How about brushing with baking soda and peroxide? I have patients that think this whitens teeth, so they brush with this. If patients are satisfied with the cleaning they get from baking soda and peroxide in terms of tooth cleaning, I wouldn't hesitate to let them do that. Peroxide definitely has great benefits in the products for helping to freshen your breath. My general concern with folks that brush with things like baking soda and peroxide is they don't get fluoride. So again, we would always encourage patients to brush with a fluoride-containing toothpaste because one of the largest diseases globally is the disease that causes cavities. We call it caries. And fluoride helps to prevent tooth decay, and that is the most important part of brushing. Is a standard done with soft bristle brushes? So I really think I think it's a medium bristle brush actually. I have to go back and check the box, but I'm pretty sure it's a medium. It's pretty much a pretty average brush. It's a square top. It's a flat trim bristle, so it's flat all the way across. It has a like a medium tough density, and I think it has like a medium bristle stiffness. And that has been the standard for decades that we use when we measure RDA with toothpaste. I got an awesome comment, so you're welcome. Thanks for passing that along. So what's Crest's lowest RDA toothpaste? That's a good question. So our lowest RDA toothpaste, I think it's Crest Cavity Protection. So if you want to go out there and use that one, that's great. Things that are very similar to Crest Cavity Protection are Crest Complete. They supply better cleaning, tartar control, better breath freshening with an RDA that's pretty similar to Crest, not that much higher, or to Crest Cavity Protections. Again, Bruce Skemmerhorn's publication is a broad survey of the literature. If you're really interested in a targeted RDA paste, again, just want to emphasize that if it's lower than 250, it is safe for lifetime of use. So pick the toothpaste that most delights you and keeps your teeth free from stain. Does abfraction increase effects of RDA? So there are cofactors related to gingival recession that can increase your susceptibility to tooth wear, and it's important to try to reduce these cofactors as much as possible. Some of them include like tooth grinding at night, malocclusions, so having poor oral hygiene leading to gingival recession. Gingival inflammation, tooth malalignment, trauma, things like that. So you try to want to avoid those things. So you can floss, you can brush with antibacterial toothpaste. You can see your dentists for regular dental cleanings. You can try to reduce tartar because excessive tartar can lead to gingival recession. So yes, all those things are important. It is really important to maintain a healthy gingiva as a way to help protect your teeth. So keep that in mind as you work with your patients. In general, does a gel versus a paste have a different abrasive qualities? I can say absolutely not. So one of the things that we do is we try to communicate to the consumer aesthetics that communicate an effect. So some of these aesthetics may include making the paste more opaque to help signal to the consumer that it's cleaning, and sometimes we make it a gel to signal to the consumer that it's a breath freshening phase, but we design their abrasives to be similar in both gels and pastes. Oh, thanks. Someone indicated the RDA of baking soda is 7. So thanks for looking that up. I think we talked about it being under 50. So 7's definitely under 50. It's definitely on the low end of the range, but it doesn't contain fluoride. So I'm going to go back to the fluoride thing. I have a patient ask me about crystalline calcium phosphate. Have you heard of this? Yeah. So calcium phosphate can come in lots of different crystal phases. So sometimes calcium phosphate is amorphous, and it's put in the toothpaste to help maintain your natural pH of your environment, of your oral cavity. And sometimes you use a crystalline calcium phosphate phase to be a toothpaste abrasive. So some of the examples of this include calcium pyrophosphate. That's a toothpaste abrasive that contains calcium and phosphate. Dicalcium phosphate dihydrate is another toothpaste abrasive that contains calcium and phosphate, and there are other examples. Those are pretty much the two notable calcium phosphate abrasives in the U.S. Crest at one time had a calcium pyrophosphate abrasive, and I think in fact that was the original Crest, launched in 1955. With fluorostat, so it had stannous fluoride and calcium pyrophosphate, I think. We don't sell that anymore today, but lots of people do use calcium phosphate abrasives. If it comes from a major manufacturer, its RDA is definitely less than 250. Does the prescription toothpaste have high abrasiveness? I don't know all prescription toothpastes. I know things available from Colgate, like Colgate's 5,000 plus. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Colgate Prevident, it doesn't have a high abrasive, and those toothpastes are designed to give you a really high level of fluoride to help arrest pre-cavitated lesions. So they're really designed to be fluoride delivery vehicles, and to the best of my knowledge, they're not highly abrasive. What is the RDA of crest cavity protection? We have designed that to be about 100, and it has been about 100 for several decades now. So it's yeah, that's one of the gold standards for cavity fighting toothpastes, and it's used the world around, and we try to make sure that stays pretty uniform always. What's a thickening abrasive? That's a really good question. So a thickening abrasive is when you pick up a tube of toothpaste, like a Crest tube of toothpaste, it'll say silica on it. So silica can be used to keep your teeth free from stain. And that's specifically, some silicas are specifically designed to have a particular shape and a particular size and a particular hardness to clean stain off your teeth. Some silicas are designed to have a particular shape and a particular hardness to thicken the toothpaste. So those tend to not be very abrasive. They tend to be used at a lot lower level, and they tend to be used by our formulating scientists to deliver a certain consistency to the toothpaste that helps it stand up on the tube, that helps it disperse in your mouth. So they come in different grades, and that's what that tends to do what thickening abrasives are used for. They're not really that abrasive. They're used to fine-tune the aesthetics of a toothpaste. Those are all the questions. I thank you for a wonderful set of questions. I thank you for being a wonderful audience tonight. I hope you learned something. I hope I was able to present what I think is an important topic for folks in a way that was easily understood.